Thanks for having me here this morning. My name is Charl. I'm Chief Strategy Officer at Secure Data. Chief Strategy Officer is the title they give you when your business has been acquired and they're not sure what they're going to do with you. So they give you these sort of nebulous titles, you know, to kind of make you think like you have a job while they figure out a way to get rid of you. So if I'm not here next year, then you'll know why. I have a very simple message this morning. We have very little time, and it's always hard for me to think, you know, what I could say that might be useful. And I'm going to distill the message for you right up front. It's a message to defenders, of people who are struggling against the likes of the anonymous hackers. And the message basically goes like this: we are in a conflict. It's dynamic and you know, amorphous. It's changing the whole time. It favors the attacker greatly. The odds are stacked very much against them. And we need to engage with that conflict. There is no end game in cybersecurity. There's no standard or baseline which we aspire to, at which point we are okay. Right? We're in this constant pull and push. And that pull and push requires us to be dynamic, to be agile, to respond quickly to shifts in the landscape. And one of the things that we need in order to be able to do that is intelligence, an understanding of what's going on around us. American fighter pilots are taught a thinking ideology called OODA, observe, orient, decide, act. It's a loop that they're engaged in. They talk about getting inside your adversary's loop. In other words, making that cycle of learning new things from around you and responding to those new things, making that cycle faster or smaller than what the adversary does in order to outmaneuver them. And we are in a cycle like that. And that cycle has to be driven by observation, by the ability to ingest new intelligence, new insights into what's happening. And I will argue in my presentation that I believe that that intelligence should come primarily from within our organizations rather than from without, because we have a fundamental advantage there. That's the crux of my message, and I'm going to try and deliver it to you in what's left of my 15 minutes. I want to start with this story. It's a story of a vulnerability we were tracking 2 or 3 weeks ago. It involved an application called Webmin. It's a Linux application that allows you to remotely manage a Linux server. And it manifests like this in the browser. You log in, and then you can do Linuxy, admin-y things on your server. There's a vulnerability in this application that turned out to be extremely easy to exploit. We were testing it. What you see on the top, complex as it looks, is literally a single line of Linux commands, a single Linux command. And at the bottom, what you see is what you would know as a command and control server, a listener. All right? And when the command triggers, what you see at the bottom now is the so-called reverse shell, which is now the text-based interface via which the attacker can enter commands and control the server. It's as simple as that. One line, hit enter, boom, you get the reverse shell. And you'll see he's logged in here as root. In other words, it's a serious vulnerability. It gives the attacker, with very little effort, complete control over the victim server. So we did a survey at the time, looking for instances of this kind of application on the internet. And between South Africa and the UK, which is where our 2 kind of major bases of operation are, at the time, we could identify over 4,000 servers of this kind. So 4,000 servers that, had we wanted to, speaking to how easy these hacks are, had we wanted to, we could have taken control of all 4,000 of those servers with literally one click. And these kinds of vulnerabilities matter, as we saw very clearly in the Equifax thing. We walk this very fine line, don't we, between hearing about something like this. And you know, if you were plugged into the internet and to the cybersecurity space, you should have heard about the Webmin bug. But between hearing about the Webmin bug, identifying where it affects you, deciding to roll out a patch and rolling out that patch, if you do it consistently and on time, you get ahead of the attacker. If you make a small mistake, like Equifax did back in March, you wait too long, you miss it, you make a strategic decision not to patch it, whatever the drivers were, that's 143 million customer records and untold impact, on their brand, on their share price, etc. So that's how fine that line is. That's the ice that we're skating on, so it matters. But I want to tell you something else about that Webmin bug, which makes it even more complicated. The Webmin bug wasn't accidental. It wasn't a coding mistake. It was injected into their code by an attacker who had compromised their, what they call build servers, so the technology that's responsible for taking the source code and packaging it up and making it available for you to download. An attacker had compromised that system and was dynamically injecting this vulnerability into the code that they were shipping so that he could go around and pick off Webmin servers at his leisure. So even had Webmin looked in their code, even had they performed a source code audit to find vulnerabilities, they wouldn't have known. They only found out about the bug when people started reporting it in the wild. Now, what I like about that story is it illustrates that point about how fluid and dynamic and chaotic this environment is. With those kinds of realities, right, with that kind of skill and malevolence stacked up against you on the one hand, and with the ice being so thin that, you know, the line between one Webmin vulnerability and an Equifax debacle is, you know, so fine. We really are in this situation where it's a little bit like running with the bulls. You know, I sort of imagine running with the bulls in Pamplona, except there are thousands of bulls, and the road never ends. You just keep going, and at any moment, you know, a bull may do something, and you're roadkill. So how do we attain an advantage in that kind of reality? How do we step up to it? And again, the fundamental point and the first point that I'm making is this is not something that ends. This is not something that, you know, you follow the 3-point plan or the NCSE guidance or the NIST framework or, you know, some technology procurement strategy and then are done. This doesn't end. The road carries on, and there will always be more bulls on it. But one of the responses, one of the sort of emerging ideologies that suggest how we might get ahead, how we might face down this bull, like the courageous girl here, is this notion of intelligence-led security. The idea that if we understand what the adversary is doing, if we can sort of read them, if we profile them, you know, if we do like NCIS, what are they called? The Navy Cyber NCIS, you know those guys. Anyway, you profile the adversary, then you can kind of predict where they're going to go next. And then you put your time and energy into that space. And so people have started talking about intelligence-led security. Let's predict where the adversary is going. But we did some research into the efficacy of that methodology. So it's notionally a great idea. We tested it in practice with a lot of data. And what we discovered was that less than 4% of the activities by bad actors that we monitor in one place will repeat somewhere else. So although notionally it makes sense to try and predict what the adversary is doing, the fact seems to be that the adversary doesn't often repeat himself or herself, right? So this manifestation of that ideology, of that notion of intelligence-led security doesn't actually seem to work. On the other hand, we did some research into the impact of finding and mitigating vulnerabilities in your environment. And we did it because within our team, we do about 500 penetration tests a year. So we take those 500 penetration tests, and we measure how long it takes a decent penetration tester to find and exploit a vulnerability. And that number, incidentally, is about 3.3 days. It takes them about 3.3 days across all of our engagements to find and exploit something, across all of our customers. However, if the penetration tester goes back to the same environment the second time, that number jumps from 3.3 to 21 days. So it becomes 7 times more expensive for the adversary to find and exploit a vulnerability if you have simply taken the time to identify those vulnerabilities within your own space and respond to them. Right? It doesn't solve the problem, but it significantly ups the cost for the adversary. And I sort of juxtapose these two kinds of intelligence. My point is that because we're in a chaotic environment outside of our networks, it's very hard to understand and predict what's going to happen. But because the environment inside our networks is fundamentally under our control, we can gather intelligence about that, like intelligence over what we have and where it's vulnerable, respond to that, and significantly improve our posture vis-a-vis the adversary. So that led me to think about this sort of pyramid of intelligence. And I think there are three categories of intelligence that we should be considering. There's what I would call above-the-line intelligence, which is about knowing the adversary. So we do need to have an awareness of what's going on in the environment in which we operate outside of our contexts. But then more importantly, I think we need to know intelligence about ourselves. And that can be things like knowing what we have and what vulnerabilities are manifest on it. So think the Webmin problem. When you hear about the Webmin problem from outside, you want to be able to know, do I have Webmin, and where is it on the inside? Does that make sense? So you need both those kinds of intelligence. Then you also want to know when the adversary acts against a vulnerability, because you can't get compromised if the anonymouses and the lolsecs and those guys don't take action against your environment. And when they take action against the environment, they're forced to cross that threshold between what's out of your control and outside and what's within your control and therefore visible to you. And so they're forced to expose themselves. And so that gives us a level of a leveling of the playing field where we can identify and respond to the adversary. So Sun Tzu famously said, know thy enemy and know yourself, and you'll be undefeated in 1,000 battles. And we like to talk a lot about knowing your enemy. That's when we talk about intelligence. That's what we think about. My argument is spend more time on knowing yourself, and you can leverage an advantage. Now, when you do that, when you want to leverage intelligence, I was talking about that OODA loop that the US Air Force uses. That intelligence has to be brought into a process, something like that OODA loop. You need the ability to ingest new data points. There's a Webmin vulnerability. Equifax got hacked. How did that happen? Anonymous is using the low-orbit ion cannon to do DDoS attacks. You need to be able to take that information in and then contextualize it within your own environment in that kind of a loop. Reorient around it. Ask yourself, what does this mean to us? And what does it mean for how we are expending our time and our energy now? What should we be focusing on, given what we know about what's happening outside and what we know about ourselves? And in that kind of loop, I believe we can sort of hit the perfect balance between agility and consistency. So you're consistently agile, right? You've industrialized agility by continuously taking in new intelligence feeds and responding accordingly. And I think that can drive measurable change in our security posture. I'm going to skip that. So there are these disciplines that you'll hear spoken about at this conference and others consistently. You'll hear about this ADPR framework. Anybody? Assess, detect, protect, respond, something like that, right? It's a way that vendors like us try and organize what we're selling you, because we have so many things to sell you. We kind of have to put them in buckets so we know which one we're talking about at any given time. And the ADPR ideology starts with this idea that there's this body of threats, this whole quorum of bad things that might deliberately or accidentally happen to you. And so what we do is we bring in protective systems, technologies, processes, people, things that try and mitigate against those attacks. And by and large, those technologies, the things like dark trace and the firewalls and the antivirus and all those things that people will sell you, they generally do what they say relatively well. If they say they're going to block certain kinds of malware, they'll generally do that. The problem is that they don't cover the entire threat landscape, and that's why compromises still keep happening, right? If protection technologies worked as advertised, these things would go away. But they don't cover the whole landscape, so those things don't go away. So what we then argue is, well, what we should do is we should assess you to find where those gaps are. So you get a pen testing company like ours in, and you say, come and tell us how you can get around these, these protections that we have in place. But your mindset, your view of the problem you're trying to solve starts with what you already know, which is where you already have the protective stuff in place. So 75% of the pen tester's effort is spent banging his or her head against that firewall that actually works, right? And, oh, is that time? And only very little is spent looking at these gaps. So we cover the little bit of the gaps off. I'll just finish the slide and then I'll be done. We cover this stats off, but we still leave these gaps on the outside. So then we put something in to detect things, to detect when the attacker gets past. And again, because we apply that detection ideology to what we already know, we cover off some risk, but basically we're just covering off the same risk that we covered off before. And so finally, we put in sort of a response capability. And by and large, if that's well coordinated and well designed, then we can respond on time when things slip past. But all of this only works if we know fully and understand completely what our entire attack surface looks like. Because what we tend to do is we miss the single thing that we should know the most about ourselves in terms of intelligence, which is where we start and where we end, where we're manifest onto the internet and where we're not. Until we can understand that, we remain incapable of responding to these kind of new threats and vulnerabilities when they emerge. And that is why understanding your attack surface matters, and that's the end of my message. Thank you.